Just like before, I'm sure you already have the Linode API token. We've already created this. I just put this in as a double check to remind people. So we've already got this and we've already set this, so we don't have to set it again. If for some reason you're working, after the fact and you're not doing these videos back to back to back or something, then make sure you set that token again appropriately. So if we look over here, now that we're in the DNS, right, there's a few variables, right? There's the token, there's the node balancer IP, which I already set, but we'll set that again, or show you how to. Right, there's a domain name, there's a start, an SOA email, right? So the start of authority email address, we have to set that. That's typically, wherever you bought the domain or what have you, right? You want to set that, or in this case, this is being used for the actual start of authority for Linode itself. So this can pretty much be whatever you want it to be. It's going to be tied to the Linode configuration. This is just creating a default record called rasa.whatever your domain is going to be, and we're going to point that to the cluster node IP basically. So we'll show you that in a few minutes. And then the typical tag is here, and then it's got the Linode name servers that it's going to set up, and then any GitHub page alias stuff and GitHub page IP stuff, right? So now, just like this mentions, right, we need to set our token. I also have it set up to where you don't put the email in the vars, so that way if for some reason you wanted to push this to GitHub or GitLab or something like that, then your email address won't be out there in the public. But for this case, we're going to set this. I'm just going to do export tf var SOA email. We're going to just change this to devopsbrian@gmail.com, right? Just like before, export tf var node balancer, right? I've set that value, so we set that. And then that's all of the secret stuff, right? And then the only other thing, and this should already have been pre-populated based on the cookie cutter, right? Just verify that your domain name is correct, and that your domain name for your alias stuff here is correct for the GitHub pages, right? And as long as that's all set, then we should be good to go, right? And that mentions those two things here. Just like before, we need to initialize our state, so we're going to do a Terraform init. And just like kind of before, we'll go through the main config real quick so you can see it's using the cloud organization. I have a new workspace, so it's separate. So this is going to be the name of the workspace it's going to create. You can see that Linode provider. And then these are just some of the records it's going to create, right? It's going to create a master record using the domain name and that SOA email, right, that we configured. It's going to create a Rasa DNS record, right, that's pointing to that node balancer IP that we set up, right? It's going to set up some of the DNS records that we need for the GitHub pages part to work correctly, and then it's also going to set up some of the CNAME records and everything that we need using some of those GitHub, using that GitHub page alias basically, right? So that's what's all being set up there. So that's all kind of being done right through all of this, and so now we've got our init. Just like the init, we can, it's all finished. So now we can do the plan to make sure everything is good here. And you'll also notice now if we come back and if we look at our workspaces, you'll see we have a new DNS workspace, right? And here in a minute, we should see the run show up from this play. Take a minute to show up. So now, right, the plan shows, hey, 7 to add, whatever, that all looks good. So if everything's happy there, we can then do the Terraform apply. All right. Hit yes, and just like before, we should see that run show up, right? We can see the previous play, we can see the one the apply that it's doing now. This part will go typically pretty fast, but it takes longer for all of the records and everything else to kind of work correctly. So right now you'll notice that it did go ahead and create the domain. You can see all of our stuff in here, right? There's that start of authority, right, that it created and everything, right? So everything in here is set up the way that we need it, but we need DNS to reflect that, right? And that could take a few minutes. And so I would recommend personally, before you go on to the next step, just to make it a little bit less painful, you wait about 30 minutes or so before you go on to the Cert-Manager step. So we're going to do that. We're going to pause, take a break for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll start on the next section, which is the Cert-Manager, to set up all of the SSL and all that. And then along with that, we'll also after the time period, we'll go ahead and get the GitHub pages redirection working and verify that works as well. So stay tuned and we'll be back in a few minutes. So we're back. Now everything is deployed. You can see it's all been applied. If we come here, right, everything looks good. If we come and we look, right, be to the right domain, everything's now set up like it was supposed to, but now all the actual replication, everything should be good to go, right? So the first thing we want to do before we kind of move on from here, we can go ahead and do the GitHub pages part real quick. And so with that, if you look at the instructions for a custom site, it recommends, you have to go ahead and put the record in here so it'll set up the custom domain part and everything, which that's the DNS stuff that we already configured. So we want to do www. In this case, I'm going to do b2the-ri.com. because that's my custom domain. Hit save. That's going to start a DNS check. This will take a few minutes. While that's running, we'll go ahead and do the next steps, and then okay, so because I waited long enough before starting back up, everything is good. So now if we go to b2the-ri.com, right, now you can see here's our GitHub pages, and it's nice and secured using the GitHub certificates for the GitHub pages stuff, right? So now that that's done, we'll kind of leave that for a second. And now we're going to move on, right? So we need to cd to the Cert-Manager directory. And so the Cert-Manager part is a little different. It's we're not going to use Terraform for that, because I like only using Terraform to deploy and build out the infrastructure, and then I like using something like Ansible, or you could even use Argo CD, which is something we might show later, to do some of the stuff that we're about to do. But Helm just makes it pretty easy too. It's just one-line commands and things to really get it going. So that being said, the Cert-Manager part is basically the part that's going to set up our SSL certs and everything automatically based on annotations that we give in the Kubernetes manifest file, or in our case, we're going to be using a Helm chart with the values file that has some information where we can supply that. And then it will auto-generate a certificate for us and set that up. And then the Rasa DNS entry that we created earlier, that will point to the node balancer. These setups that we're about to do, will redirect through the node balancer, and that's kind of how the whole piece kind of works from end to end, right? So that being said, if you don't already have Helm, you need to install it. It's pretty straightforward. If you go here, depending on your setup, you can just curl it and run the shell script. It just depends on which way you want to install it, right, on your platform. So once you have Helm installed, you want to make sure real quick that we can still get to the cluster, right? Even though we're in this other directory, if you ran that export command correctly, we should still be able to get our cluster info and the kube commands. Yep, right, so it still works. So now what we want to do is just run this command. This is going to apply some prereqs kind of required from Cert-Manager to work before we do the full install. So we're going to run this command. And just like the output here in the example, we should see some of that start to show up. Right. now we can actually install Cert-Manager. So Helm is like a package manager basically for Kubernetes that you can install what are called Helm charts, which are, you know, applications or infrastructures. You can install Postgres with Helm charts. You can install, in this case, we're going to be using Rasa, but you know, for now we're going to be installing Cert-Manager with that, and then that's going to, you know, set up all of the configuration in Kubernetes that we need for this to work. So we're going to add that Cert-Manager. We're going to do a Helm repo update, right? And then we're going to run this command to actually install Cert-Manager. This will take a few minutes sometimes to run, but when it's finished, we should get some output kind of similar to this. While I'm waiting to, this is because we generated that file and we haven't really like locked it down. I'd recommend looking into the permissions of Kubernetes config files and how they should actually be set up from that perspective. That'll get rid of these errors, and it'll also be better in general. Typically, you want that configuration locked down to the main user that, you know, you're logged in with, but that's what that error message is from. So now Cert-Manager is done, right? So I should be able to run this command. We should see those pods running. Basically, after after that's all running, we've waited long enough before we set up all of the other DNS stuff. So everything should kind of, you know, work from here from you know, this perspective. So we're going to set up the cluster resource and everything next. So I've already exported out the email excuse me, that I'm going to use. This envir substitute, what it's basically doing is inside of Cert-Manager, there's this Acme issuer file that's basically used with Let's Encrypt. That's, you know, the configuration that tells it how to get and generate the SSL certs. And so you need an email for this because it's using Let's Encrypt and connecting with them, and so they kind of require an email for this. And so what I've done is I put a var here, so you don't have to put this in version control if you want to, you know, save all of this in GitHub or something. But what you do is you, just like kind of before, you export email to whatever your email is going to be, which I've already done, and then we can now run this command, which is going to basically substitute out of this file that var, right, and replace it, and in line it's then going to apply it, right? So nothing really ever gets saved with the variable in it. So we can now run that command. Right, it says it's been created. That'll update the email section, right, of the file automatically and apply it, right? This part I do like to wait a few minutes because it needs to set up all of the Cert-Manager, nginx ingress, some of the initial SSL stuff up to Let's Encrypt and everything. So I like to wait about 10-15 minutes or so before we start the next part. So we're going to pause here real quick, and then we'll be right back and start the next section. Now we're back. We've waited a few minutes, right, to make sure all of the stuff that we need for this to kind of work has been set up, and it's all kind of there, right? So now we want to go back and go into the Rasa directory, right? And just like before, we're going to use Helm to do some installs here. So we're going to add it, and we're going to do a repo update. So in case you haven't watched the previous video, Rasa is an open source chatbot platform. And it allows you to build chatbots pretty easily. There'll be a link in the description to the previous video that I'm referring to if you want to find out more information about that. But basically, we're going to be deploying that bot that we set up in the previous video, which is just a very basic demo bot that's coming from Rasa that I haven't updated yet. And then we deployed a model file, and that's now stored as a release on GitHub, and we're going to be pointing to that file. So that's basically what the instructions here are referring to. So if you look now, there is a Rasa values file, and in here this is relative to their instructions. So if you go out and you look for Rasa Helm charts, right? You can see there's a link, and we're using the open source one. And so out here they have a values file, and so what we're doing is we're adding, we're using sections from that, right, to tell it the initial model and other things that we need it to do. And so that's kind of what's being done here. And so in here, what's happening, the initial model, this is the repo that we created in the previous video with the file that I mentioned, right? So it's just going out there and it's going to download that and use that for the initial bot's model. And then these are just telling the bot to set up a socket.io channel and listen, so that way we can talk to it. And this is the image of Rasa that it's going to use. And then we're telling it to not enable nginx by default, because we don't need that since we already have the ingress and the nginx from that doing everything. And then this is kind of where the magic is happening. So because we have the Cert-Manager ingress and everything set up with nginx and everything, we can change this to be enabled for an ingress. We can give it the annotation to tell it, hey, use nginx for the ingress. And for Cert-Manager, this is the Let's Encrypt prod, and this is tying back to when we set up Cert-Manager in here. Remember, we called this Let's Encrypt prod. It had a metadata for that. So that's what that is tying to. So by putting that in and then putting the path to tell it, hey, when you go to the root of rasa.btotherai.com, then it's going to create a secret called Rasa TLS with this host information, and that's going to generate our certificate basically and put it inside of this secret inside of Kubernetes, right? So that's kind of what's happening here. And so with all of that in there, we can basically do a Helm install, give it this file, and tell it to install install something called Rasa from the Rasa/Rasa Helm chart location. And so by doing that, it will go out and it will deploy this, right? And it's even going to say, hey, like, here's the Rasa URL, which right now it should not be working, right? So if we open up an incognito window and we go there, and it should be the status route, right? So, and you can see the cert right now is complaining too, and it's not even there, right? So like right now it's not working. So, but it takes a few minutes for this to all get set up. So we can do kubectl git pods. And you'll see that the Rasa pod is initializing right now, right? So we can more or less come here, and I think we just called it mid-action where it was creating our certificate right there. You can see where that pod's terminating, right? So it should disappear now, right? So now if we do kubectl logs on that name, right, of the Rasa pod, it may not be up completely, so it probably won't give it to us yet, and it'll tell you, right, hey, like, it's waiting to come up, it's waiting in pod initializing. So we just have to wait until the pod is actually shows running. So you can see the Postgres that it uses for the tracker store is already up. So typically after that, not long, you'll see the Rasa pod come up. So it just takes a few minutes depending on how big your model file is and what it's trying to do. Alright, so now it shows running, right? It's not ready because it's not completely all the way up, but it's at least running. So now we can run that logs command and we can start seeing it, right? So if we do a follow, we can start following this and we can see like what it's doing. So you saw up there a minute ago, right? It started it and it started loading our model. Where was it? It was up here at the top somewhere. Right here, right? Loading model. So it put our model and called it this file and then extracted it, started training the bot and everything. That's what it's doing right now. It's setting the bot up and doing the TensorFlow and all the other stuff that it needs to do. Right now it's loading the model. So when this is all done, we should see a message that'll basically end up saying that the Rasa server is up and is running, and it might even say like the IP address of the pod, and it should say like colon, I think it's 5005. When we get to that point, we know that point that Rasa is actually running, and then we should see the status message up here. Now sometimes, like I said, the certificate stuff can take a few even for the generation and everything on the internet to kind of sync, because remember when we ran the apply command, it actually goes out and generates a certificate and everything right on the fly, and so it might take a few minutes for that to completely sync across everything. But like I said, you can see Rasa server's up and running, and it's it's got everything going. So at this point, if we hit Control C and we do kubectl git pods again, we can see Rasa is ready now, right? So this should be working. It might take a minute, but right, see, now we can see the version and everything is right. The certificate might still show invalid for a few. It's showing a fake certificate right now from Acme. It might take a few, right, for this to show up and actually work correctly and look like it's from Let's Encrypt and everything. Same thing in some of the browsers, we even show it differently. So like if we want to test Edge, for example, we can drop this in Edge. And I noticed even like weird things with it where like Edge wouldn't sometimes even open stuff correctly, right? So it's just some of the browsers do weird things, so it just takes a few for different things to sync and where they're pulling from. But either way, we can see that this is working. It will take a few before the whole thing will actually show that the certificate is valid and everything. So we'll pause here for a minute and wait for that to update. While that's updating though, we can go ahead and get the GitHub pages part set up, and we can work through some of that, right? So we're going to minimize this real quick. And at this point, we've already gone through the Git pods. We made sure it was up to date, and we were able to hit the status, endpoint, right? So the last thing that we want to do is we could do two things, right? There is a chat widget built into this little folder that you can just, go and say reveal and explore. And then if you want, we can open this with Chrome, right? And it's got the little widget, and if it's all up and ready, if we say hello, right, it says, hey, how are you doing, right? And I'm okay. And so you're going to say yes, right? So the basic demo bot is there, and it's working, and we're talking to it through this just little chat widget that we instantiated here in this local web page, basically, right? This local HTML document. So now that works, we can go and take this to the next level, right? We can go to our pages repo here, right, that we created, and you can modify this and do all of that to set it up the way you want it. But the easy thing right off the bat is we can go to the index.html, we can modify this, and if we read like what this tells you, it's already set up, right? Like, because I've got the docs auto-generating from the cookie cutter stuff, it's even already generated correctly. So as long as you set up everything and set it correctly, you can literally just copy this entire section, right? Come over here, drop that in, right? Commit it. It'll take a second for this to build. And all this is doing is just building our GitHub pages by default are Jekyll pages, so it's just building the Jekyll artifacts and everything, and then it's going to deploy them to their setup the way they do it to host this stuff in their infrastructure. So that's all it's doing right now. Right? It's reporting the build status is good, so then it's going to deploy it. Now everything's good, right? Now, as you can see, because we set that custom thing up, it's like, oh, your docs are available here, right? So we'll close out these old links. And now if we come here, you see we have the chat. Because of the pages, you can see it kind of messes up the widget, so you might have to tweak that a little bit. But, it can see it's working, right? Like the bot is responding and everything is happy there. The last piece, like I mentioned, is, it might take a few before this certificate actually, you know, shows up. Now it's showing that it's a valid one. So if we hard refresh, or if we close this out, come here, right, it shows correctly, right? It's got the secure, everything's happy, and we're good to go, right? So it's kind of that piece in a nutshell. Like it goes through a lot here, but you know, the whole goal is to show you kind of how you can, one, not only have a cluster running on your local computer if you don't have a super fancy, you know, expensive computer with a bunch of cores and a bunch of RAM and stuff or whatever, then you can run your own little cluster in the cloud for, you know, $40 a month, and you know, test things there, right? You don't have to expose anything. If you don't do the ingress and you don't expose it with the ingress, then it never even shows up, right, for people to access. So we'll talk about some other video in future videos, you know, how that works with no balancers and not using no balancers and doing port forwarding and some of that stuff. But in general, hopefully this helped. If for some reason you just wanted to do this as a demo and you're done and you want to tear everything down, the process is pretty straightforward as well. I do need to update the docs with those steps, but basically for the most part, all you have to do is go into the DNS folder, right? Remember, we were doing Terraform Apply before. Now we can just do Terraform Destroy. Just like before, it's going to now tell us like what it's going to get rid of and what it's going to tear down, right? And then we have to apply that. And it knows what we have based on state, right? So in that workspace's state directory, if you look at some of the state files and stuff, you'll see it's keeping track of everything it built and the URLs and the connections for them and what they are. And that's how it knows like what it has to go out and delete as well, right? And so the cool thing about all this is like now I just got rid of all of those DNS records, right? So if I go here, you can see it doesn't exist anymore, right? Now I just have my existing domain that I had before. Kubernetes is still here, right? The Be to the Right demo, so we need to get rid of that. So we can go to the LKE directory, and just like before, we can do the Terraform Destroy command. And this is cool because you can build out infrastructures, you can tear them down, you can build out pieces, right? So like that's why I split these into multiple files, because I wanted the cluster to be built out first, then I want to do DNS. Maybe I want to manage my DNS stuff separately, right? So now I could update and add things to the DNS Linode without having to update my Kubernetes, right? So it makes sense to split things out, you know, depending on how you want them to work. And so that's kind of why these are split into separate folders in the repo. Typically I do that, you know, even with my own stuff, right? So if I'm building out, say, some big AWS environment, I might have, you know, the networking and VPCs and stuff in one folder. I might have, you know, some other stuff in a different folder, and then I might have a main one that calls some of these submodules in and everything, and then, you know, builds them all out. But then I can bring those pieces in and run them when I want to run them, kind of thing. So it depends on what you're trying to do. Terraform is a really cool product and can be very cumbersome and very difficult, but it can also, you know, if you start out with the small things and grow and learn, there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with it, right? So that being said, now if I look over here, this cluster is now gone, right? So now I just have my old one, right? DevOps with Brian. And so now everything is destroyed, right? Everything that I just built out, is now gone, and it's all been taken care of, right? So either way, hopefully this helped. Stay tuned. We'll do, you know, more videos around Kubernetes and stuff as a general rule, and how to use it, and, you know, how to take and build applications locally, you know, put them in Docker, test them locally, test them in Kubernetes locally, and then ultimately, you know, deploy your applications with Kubernetes out into the cloud, right? So stay tuned, and hopefully this helps, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks. Bye.